introduce myself. I am Eric Jahnke, and I'm serving as the Dean of the College of Letters and Science, and this is our community lecture series. And the sad news is that this is the last one of the year for our community lecture series. So we'll have to kind of get you all back here again in the fall when we have a new group of talks for you. This evening's talk is going to be presented by Dr. Brad Mace Martin. He came to us in 2008. He started teaching us in 2008. Completed his doctorate in political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializing in environmental policy and planning and research. And so we're going to let him take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Give everyone a moment to get seated. So, approximately a year ago is when I was asked to give this talk, and pardon me, I have a bit of a cold. And at the time, I was sort of like, okay, I will, cover the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and these are incredibly important things to discuss. And in the intervening time period, the last year, a lot changed with water policy. Or at least is in the midst of changing. And so I figured instead of just telling you about maybe the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act and leaving it at that, I would narrow it down a bit so that we could talk about what are some of these big changes and how they're likely to affect water quality across the United States with some discussion of how they're going to impact what's going on here in Wisconsin, given changes in our own laws. So that'll be the kind of general direction that I go in. But to start with, this is, for those who are unaware, right, the state governor has declared this the year of water, which worked out really well for me because in 2018, I didn't know that it would be the year of water. It just so happened to be that that's what I was working on. So, let's hope, okay. What I wanted to start by showing is that the concerns that a lot of people have about water are not unique. What is unique is that even among environmental issues, water stands out. So what we have here is just a quick comparison of some of the Gallup polls over the years. And that's where there's missing years is when they don't ask the question, showing how water issues sort of stack up against things like air pollution, toxic waste, extinction, rainforests here in green, and global warming in red. So the purple line that sort of moves along the top there, that's drinking water pollution. And so the question is phrased from the folks at Gallup, right, to list, your level of concern. Are you a little concerned? Are you kind of fairly concerned? Are you a great deal concerned about water? And one of the things we see is that drinking water and water pollution consistently rank, if not as the highest issue, as one of the highest issues. And this means also that the public doesn't really differentiate. Right? Drinking water, while it does tend to get the highest level of polling response, is followed in a close second here by water pollution, which the way that the question is phrased refers to lakes, rivers, reservoirs. So that's the general point that I wanted to start from, is that the concerns that we see in Wisconsin, that I'm about to go over a bit, are concerns that happen across the country. But if you've been reading the news in the last couple of years, you may have noticed we have one set of concerns, right? Dr. George Kraft from UWSP spent years modeling the effects of high-capacity wells on nearby water sources. That would be what we call a water supply concern, right? And what I want to talk today about is not so much water supply, because that's, while a very important topic, not directly related so much to the quality of water that we drink, which is what I want to turn our attention to. So here's a short but relatively packed list of headlines just from the past few months. If you run, I don't know, any news search on water in Wisconsin, I took these almost entirely from the past 3 months, that we have concerns about nitrate contamination in wells. We have concerns about the groundwater pollution from coal ash. We have concerns about contamination from E. coli, right, as well as nitrates. So Kewaunee County in recent months has made, sort of headlines for some of the risks that are posed to private wells there. And the problem has gotten big enough that we've started to attract national or outside of the state attention. But there's a particular dynamic, and I think it's captured well in the New York Times headlines, that I'm going to focus on, which is what is it about a rural community that is endangering the water that we drink? So in Wisconsin, right, this is the Geological Survey's susceptibility map. And if you look right here in the middle, we have Portage County, right, sitting right in here. And we are bright red, which means, according to this, we are the most susceptible to groundwater contamination, along with areas in the North Woods. Right? But if we take a look at that map, we stand out as pretty susceptible. And so what that means is the things that are applied to our surface, the surface of our land, run the risk of getting into the water that our drinking water is drawn from, so our groundwater supply. And if we pause for a second and look, right, some of the concerns that we've seen in these headlines are concerns about nitrate. Here again, we see Portage County sitting out in the middle. And this is all data taken from the Center for Watershed Science and Education here at UWSP. What they've helped us to see is that these problems are somewhat localized in different areas where agriculture is heavy, but also where that contamination susceptibility occurs. So that same bright red that we saw here in the contamination map is also present for nitrates, which in this area are deriving from particularly the application of fertilizers. We also see bacteria contamination of drinking water wells. So that's the image to your right. And what this is it's a measurement of bacteria, not all of which are necessarily dangerous, right? So I don't want it to be somehow taken as an indicator that every one of those red dots is saying that people are being exposed to pathogens that are illness-causing. But it does raise concerns if you're finding bacteria in your water, right, in your private well supply, that what you're running the risk of is being exposed to things like E. coli. So in certain parts of the state, most recently, Mark Borchardt out at the U.S. Geological Survey, I think over in Neillsville, recently was able to use DNA testing to trace the source of that bacterial contamination back to the nearby cattle farms, right? Nearby, particularly the concentrated animal feeding operations. And so his data allows us to talk about the data he most recently published this past February, allows us to show a correlation between how close you are to a animal feeding operation and the likelihood that your well is contaminated with coliform bacteria. So these are two of the water quality concerns that we have in the state. Another two, not quite as prevalent in Portage County, but still worth noting, are lead levels. And so may have heard in recent years, right, lead in particularly the municipal water supply. That is primarily what we're talking about here. So that would be lead that comes in through the pipes that are running through the city, right? A lot of these are old lead pipes. And not always the easiest to identify and to remove. This is one different water quality issue, and not one that we're going to talk a whole lot about today, but one that's worth being aware of. And then finally, in other parts of the state, not quite as prevalent here, is arsenic contamination. So all of these are about different things that are getting into our drinking water in different areas of the state. But in order for me to explain sort of the legal aspects of this, I need to pause and introduce a distinction. The distinction is between public water suppliers and private water suppliers. So if you're on a private well, you are, for most legal purposes, your own water system. That is, you don't really have much in the way of legal protection from nearby groundwater contamination. Public water systems are governed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So in that case, right, I think it was 2012, in Stevens Point, I think it was well 5, exceeded the EPA limit of 10 parts per billion of nitrate. And so because the EPA sets this limit, the Safe Drinking Water Act governs the city's water supply. Whenever the city exceeded that limit, it sent out a notice to everybody who uses that water. So if you remember back a few years, if you lived in Stevens Point and you were a homeowner, you may have gotten this letter saying that well 5 has exceeded, I think it hit 12 parts per billion was the measured level, and that they were going to be having to deal with that. And this is something that municipalities around the country that are in primarily agricultural areas have been forced to deal with. But the difference between the public and the private is not simply that the level of protection that you receive, it's that the Safe Drinking Water Act is what governs public systems, and the Clean Water Act is really what covers everything else. And so private well owners are overwhelmingly dependent on the quality of water in the surrounding area, right, or in the underlying aquifer. And so what I want to talk about is something that is common to both of these systems, even though the public water issues around, for instance, lead are very important, there is a common denominator that I think we can talk about a little bit more carefully. So this is an incredibly busy slide. I'll just pause for a second. I know it's the EPA's, and it's really small. It was the best I could do to show all these issues in one slide. So this is a map, and it's color-coded. And what we'll see is that when we try to identify risks to the water supply, those risks enter in through locations like concentrated animal feeding operations up here. A livestock waste lagoon is situated there. So each of the ones colored in red is deemed a risk. And what we can see is these risks sort of accumulate across the landscape, right, and then filter down through the topsoil here and end up in the saturated zone beneath the water table. Now, one other important point is they also then move their way down into this, what for legal purposes is I'm going to call a navigable waterway. Oh, pardon me one moment. So when we think about the different areas of the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, what we're really trying to make sense of is how it is that what happens across this whole landscape at each of these red points, from pesticide and fertilizer application on fields to urban sprawl, to private septic systems, waste lagoons, landfills, mining operations, how all of these things sort of accumulate and filter down through the soil into our groundwater. And the legal problem is, how do you protect that groundwater? So this is where we need a moment to think about the structure of US law. US law has very few, at the federal level, protections of anything other than surface water. So let me see if I can explain what I mean here. Oh, pardon me, now I can't see out of my glasses. So US law, right, at the federal level, so here I'm talking about the United States government as separate from the Wisconsin state government. But US law operates through the Clean Water Act primarily and the Safe Drinking Water Act. But what makes those important is the target of them. So the Safe Drinking Water Act is aimed at human health, which means in the Constitution there's a clear goal that the federal government has an overarching interest or an overriding interest in protecting the health of citizens. But that means what we're talking about there is water that emerges sort of directly from your municipal supplies. So when you turn on the tap, the water that comes out of that, that is what is protected by federal water, with some protection of what's underground near those wells. But most of the rest of this landscape here, particularly out here where we start talking about how we're changing our landscape whenever we do things like remove trees and build new houses, or when we apply fertilizers, those changes excuse me, are governed under the Clean Water Act. And what makes this an important distinction is the Clean Water Act comes from, or derives its authority under the Constitution from the Commerce Clause. Now, that's going to be a really big deal. So if we think back to sort of our high school civics, when we think about where does Congress, when it's passing a law, get its powers from, it gets its powers from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, right? Which most of us are familiar with the basic powers of taxation. But along with that, there's a few others listed. It's not a terribly extensive list, but one of the broadest, and one of the ones that's been applied most in the 20th century, has been the power to regulate interstate commerce. Now, it just so happens that in 1824, that involved a case having to do with a waterway in New York called Gibbons versus Ogden. And in that case, it was declared that, yes, it is in fact the federal government that has authority over these interstate waterways that are navigable. Now, at the time, I'm sure no one had a clue that the impact 200 years later would be that this definition of a navigable waterway as the sort of place in which the federal government can exercise its authority would have such a restrictive effect on what we're trying to do. But it turns out this is one of the biggest parts that shape how we protect water, is this decision made in 1824 that says navigable waterways are a channel of interstate commerce, and because they're a channel of interstate commerce and you can float a boat down them and you can sell things on that boat, therefore the federal government has that authority. So in this case, what we'd be talking about really is this river that passes through here, right? That's what the US government can deal with. All the rest of these things over here start to raise very important questions, because that's primarily what the state government deals with. Right, so that's going to come back to be an important point later in the talk whenever I finish talking about how does the federal government go about regulating this, and why is it actually important that the federal government regulate these land sources out here. So let me move along here. The way in which the law operates, right, when we talk about the Clean Water Act and its application to all this broad land use, is that Congress, right, writes the law. So what's it going to do in that law? It sets the goals of what the law is trying to accomplish, which under the Clean Water Act is to protect the integrity of the waterway, right? And that's going to be different from, for instance, the Safe Drinking Water Act, where the goal is to protect human health. So protecting the biological integrity of the waterway is the stated goal of the Clean Water Act. And how it goes about doing that is part of what we'll have to learn about here. But it does that by dividing all sources of water pollution, what are known as discharges of pollutants, divides those into two categories that we'll talk about in just a second. And those categories are what we regulate. And so once that's decided by Congress, this gets handed over technically to the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Environmental Protection Agency sets the standards for what it is that we will be exposed to. So for instance, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, 10 parts per billion nitrate is established by the EPA. The Army Corps of Engineers handles issuing some of the permits. But most of what we're going to see is the EPA has to determine this strange phrase that's used in the Clean Water Act, which is, what are the waters of the United States? Because that ends up being the phrase that says which waters the law applies to and which ones it doesn't. So if it's considered a water of the United States, then the federal government is able to regulate it. If it's considered not a water of the United States, then the federal law doesn't apply. Now, how this actually works in practice is simply that the EPA creates its set of regulations, right, creates a way of implementing the law, and then it does so under the Clean Water Act in conjunction with state governments. So the Clean Water Act says that state governments maintain the primary responsibility for handling the permitting of point source water, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. And then finally, the state government, once it's told what to do, right, once it works in conjunction with the EPA to establish its water quality program, then hands that off to the Wisconsin State DNR, where they will actually go about setting more precise standards and issuing permits. But in the background to all this is something that we're going to come back to at the end, which is states don't have to just do what the federal government says, right? What this means is the federal government can set a limit, and you're not allowed to pollute more than that limit. But the state could say, well, we want a lower limit, right? We want to be even more protective of the waters of this state. And in Wisconsin, that power derives, well, all states have it through their police power, but in Wisconsin we have this really cool thing called the public trust doctrine. Right? And the public trust doctrine says that the protection of waterways actually in certain cases will override even private property rights to make sure or to ensure that water is protected as a source for the public good in the long term. So Wisconsin actually has this very powerful tool in its tool belt to start to regulate water at a much more strict level. The question is, will it do so? So I introduced this distinction. I want to make sure we understand it because legally it matters. The distinction is between what's called a point source pollution or point source pollutant and a non-source pollutant. So here's the legal definition. For those who don't get to spend a lot of time reading law, I figured I would provide it. It's section 502, subsection 12, that says the term point source, and welcome to reading law, it's not the clearest. It says means any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, including but not limited to any pipe, ditch, channel, tunnel, conduit, well, discrete fissure, container, rolling stock, concentrated animal feeding operation, or vessel or other floating craft from which pollutants are or may be discharged. So, to find out if something is a point source, you simply have to check this list, and if it is from a discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, it counts as a point source. The term does not apply to agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from irrigated agriculture. This sentence here introduces a key distinction in the law, which is most of the things that we're exposed to in a rural area like Wisconsin are things that are going to come from agricultural discharge and runoff. And yet, what we start to see is, at least at the federal level, the law is pretty clear that those are kind of a separate matter entirely. They don't count as point source pollution. Now, why is that important? Because if it's a point, then it has to have a permit. What agriculture and other things like rainwater runoff from urban surfaces count as non-point source pollution. Non-point simply means it doesn't meet that definition. There is no more precise definition than that. So there is a point, and then there's everything else. And typically when we think of a point source pollutant, we think of something coming out of a pipe, right? But that can be a little misleading because even for non-point source pollutants, it can gather up rainwater runoff and it can still enter into waterways through a pipe, but it comes from lots of different places. So it comes from the runoff from our cars. Every spring we see the water has that nice oily sheen to it as the winter runoff carries it away. And so that is, that's going to enter into our surface waters. Over here we have a photo, this is actually taken from California, of a plant discharging, I forget what it's discharging, but we can see it's pretty clearly exiting from the plant out into the bay. All right, so that qualifies as a point source, meaning they have to go get a permit in order for the water to leave that pipe. So what makes this important as a political scientist, right? So I'm not a lawyer, so you have to take that for what it's worth. But as a political scientist, what matters is that what we start to see when we think about why does the law function the way it does is that the law is making this distinction, right? The law is telling states, please do this, right? There's certain steps you must follow. We'll call those procedural requirements. It says, here's how you should go about doing what you're doing. Those are the steps or the process that you follow. And states are incredible at following it. If the federal government tells states that they have to follow a certain set of steps, states will almost inevitably follow that. Right? The actual failure rate, which I didn't include as a slide, but the actual failure rate for states at all under the Clean Water Act was about 11%, and that was primarily in the mid-1970s whenever the law was first introduced and states were really struggling to implement it. But in recent years, regardless of what we're trying to regulate, whether it be requiring a permit or whether it be trying to get states to do something about all this agricultural runoff, whenever the federal government asks, states tend to do it. The problem is, what are you asking them to do? Right? So when we talk about point sources, what we're saying is there's this thing called the Npdes, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's a fancy way of saying that's the permit name that you need. But what it is it says you must follow these procedures, you must go through these steps whenever you're going to discharge out of a pipe, and when you do, you must meet certain criteria, right? You must have a water quality of a certain level. It is specified in your permit, right? That, when done correctly, when states actually implement that, not only do we see that states follow what's required, but we see that the pollution plummets way down. So you may be, I figured I would spare everybody the photo of the Cuyahoga River burning because, well, if you're in any of my classes, you've seen it before, and for many others, you probably are familiar with it. So I thought, okay, I won't use the Cuyahoga River, but right, one of the things we've seen over the years is right, these dramatic fires that were caused by point source pollutants in particularly the 1950s and 60s. We don't have that problem anymore. Point source pollution has been remarkably controlled by the Clean Water Act. It has been, as we would consider it, an incredibly successful set of policies. Now, it's not a perfect set, but that means things coming out of pipes at industry, right, if you go and see, are regulated very well. The problem comes in when we start talking about those things that run off the land and start seeping in, the non-point source pollutants. Right? States, again, follow what they're told to do, but what they're told to do doesn't amount to very much. So the way that this is the only person that in all of political science who has actually done an in-depth study of the effectiveness of the Clean Water Act. There is entirely one source about it, and it's a guy named John Hornbeek. So he published this in 2011, and that's it. That's all that exists. So he said, right, the procedural measures, what states are asked to do, wonderful. States, we have a high rate of compliance with federal mandates. But the substance, what you're supposed to do in terms of how strictly are we protecting that water, the substantive questions are too low. Here, right, with permits, states are being asked to do something, and the standards are very high, and they accomplish it. With non-point source pollution, the standards are very low. States aren't accomplishing much effective control, but they are still doing what they're told to do. Right? And so what this suggests is that what's called the supportive federal policy structure, and I'll explain that term in a minute, is failing us. Right? So what we mean by supportive policy structure is when we think of, legally speaking, point source pollution, what we're talking about is you must do this. It's a mandate. Right? There is a law. It says what to do, and if you don't do it, there's a clear consequence. Right? Non-point source pollution, the federal government tells states, we'd really like it if you would, and then introduce right, some standard, and the states sort of comply, but the only way that they can do it is by waiving money in front of them. And that money comes through Section 319H of the Clean Water Act. So this is just a graph of how funding has gone since 1995 when it was introduced, measured in millions. Right, and so it started out, introduced in the mid-90s at about 100 million when this problem was really sort of first being brought to the kind of legislative table for the federal government to deal with. And we see that towards the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, funding support for state non-point source pollution programs rises, and then it sort of just falls by the wayside. It never goes quite back to its earlier level, but it never really keeps up with the problem. Right, the funding is introduced, and the recession doesn't help it any, and we're seeing it sort of recovering here at the tail end, but not by a whole lot. And the problem is the states are required to match the fund at 40%, and that's it. So as much as the federal government gives, that's how much states spend. There are very few states outside of Oregon, Washington, and California that actually spend more than that, and the only reason they do is because they're on a separate funding system that applies only to coastal states. So here what we see is that this supportive role, this saying, here's some money if you would please fix your non-point source pollution problem, isn't adding up to enough to actually protect groundwater, particularly in rural areas. So what I'm going to turn our attention to now is the legal reasons as they've moved through the courts about why it is that protections are the way they are. And here we'll come back to that Clean Water Act. All right? The Clean Water Act reliance on the Commerce Clause. So 3 key cases here. And one of them is a little bit misleading, so I will pause when I get there. But there were 3 key cases that have happened that have shaped how groundwater is being protected. So if we think about these non-point source pollutants, the agricultural runoff as it applies to the ground, what we can see is that the role of the government is determined by, or the role of the Clean Water Act is determined by whether or not it's a navigable waterway. So we know for a fact, going back to 1824, the federal government can regulate navigable waterways. The question is, what about water that's near it? Right? So when we think about things like wetlands, which play this crucial role in protecting water quality, what wetlands are encompassed? Right? So some wetlands, insofar as they're near the navigable waterway, they're going to be included. But what we're going to find is that those wetlands that are further away, and I'll show you some graphs here in a moment to help clarify the issue, but wetlands, as they get further removed from navigable waterways, become more and more of a legal question. Let me repeat why that is. Because the further they get from that navigable waterway, the less direct connection they have to interstate commerce. Because the law is written through the lens of interstate commerce, the law must come back to how it is that regulating water and wetlands has to do with interstate commerce. So the first case comes out of Lake St. Croix, Michigan. A developer called Riverside Bayview Homes in the 1980s was seeking to develop land, and the question at hand was, would they require a permit? So what they wanted to do was dig some stuff up, right, and dump it off to the side. But the place they wanted to dump it was a wetland. And so the Army Corps of Engineers said, you can't put that fill, right, in the wetland. You can't just fill in the wetland to develop. Right, so the question is, do they need a permit for this? And the Riverside Bayview case was that the developers said, you don't have, right, the Army Corps engineer does not have the authority to tell us that we must have a permit to do this with our property. Right? Your jurisdiction only applies to that navigable waterway. The wetland alongside of it, that's not yours. So this makes its way through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court hears it and arrives at what I thought was a pretty clear decision, which is that if the waterway, in this case it was directly adjacent to a navigable waterway, that is, they actually had what we would think of as sort of topographic connection. Like if you looked at a map, you would see the wetland, you'd see the river running next to it, you'd have no question about it. This was the only map I could actually find of the original Riverside Bayview land, but you will see this is the waterway moving through, this is the Riverside Bayview property where they were dumping. So all the wetlands on this property are immediately in connection to that little waterway that you see passing through right there. I'm sorry, that's the best I could get for you. But right, the court said, well, the Army Corps of Engineers has been left with this incredibly difficult task of trying to figure out where does land start and water stop? Right? Where do you delineate the wetland? And in that process, the Supreme Court said, we consider this to be a very reasonable interpretation of the law by the Army Corps Engineer. We're going to let them stick with it. Right? So they exercise what's known as administrative deference here. And that, for a long time, was the standard, was if your waterway was navigable, you definitely could regulate it under the Clean Water Act. And if you had a wetland that was adjacent to it, you definitely can regulate it under the Clean Water Act. But it left open the question of, like, what about other waterways? Because there's a lot of wetlands that aren't directly next to it. And so in the 1990s, this took a different turn. So in the 1990s, the court became a little bit more suspicious of using the Commerce Clause to try to encompass lots of different areas of law. And so they started to the Supreme Court started to roll back some of that authority that it had granted to Congress earlier. And in a case, Swansea, Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County versus Army Corps Engineer out of Illinois, right, we have a similar issue. You have a developer. He purchases the property in 1980, or I should say, in 1980, he starts filling it in with sand in the hope of building a mall there. Right? But he does so without a permit. So again, he's filling in a wetland with sand. He doesn't have a permit. And the rule by which his property, he was told he needed a permit under the Army Corps of Engineer, was known as the migratory bird rule. So he was filling in property, sorry, misspoke. The Solid Waste Agency was looking to use a landfill in northern Illinois. And the landfill that they had cited for was previously a mine. And it filled in with water since in 1960 when they stopped using the mine. And so what happens is they fill it in, and they want to use it as a landfill. And the migratory bird rule says, well, migratory birds are now using those waters, right, where the mine had been filled in. They then fly over to the, right, so they use it, they exist in this wetlands, they need this to be protected, but they fly between a navigable waterway and the old mine. The question then was, is that a sufficient connection? Can you regulate, can you require a permit? And the actual waterway was 20 miles away from a navigable water. So can you require a wetland that's 20 miles away to get a permit because it has a connection to a navigable waterway that simply exists as a result of birds flying back and forth? And there, the court said, no, that's too far. In a very sort of heated opinion, Antonin Scalia made a pretty bold assertion that that was far more than the Commerce Clause would allow for the Clean Water Act. And that marked the sort of broadest time up until then that the Clean Water Act applied to wetlands. Since then, it has been sort of figuring out, well, how much does it still apply? And then in 2006, it got really crazy. So in 2006, in the case of Rapinos, again, we're dealing with the developer. Sorry, I misspoke in the previous one. This was the developer who in 1980 started filling in his property for a mall. And against the better judgment of even some of his own staff, said, I don't need a permit. And so this one, much like the previous ones, it's not an isolated wetland. Here, it was a human-built tributary. The question is, do you need a permit? And it goes to the court. And they gave us utter chaos out of this. So the Supreme Court hears the case. And it seems like what we're asking is, okay, it's a waterway. We know that adjacent waters are definitely covered because of the 1985 case. And we know that if it's what's called an isolated water, and it's only connected by birds, that it's not covered. But what if it's a berm that humans built and that isn't really in use anymore? Does that one count? And the court threw us this curveball. So it is, as far as I'm aware, the only opinion that is a 4-1-4 vote in the Supreme Court, which makes it a confusing case because you need a majority, right? And I'm not a mathematician here, but I know that 4 and 4 are equal, so nobody has a majority. And what's amazing is in this case, again, you have Scalia writing for the court. He writes for 4 of the people of the court, and he says that the Army Corps of Engineers has misapplied this entirely beyond the intent of Congress, right? And he specifies that not only is it waters that are adjacent to navigable waterways, but he says they have to be permanent. He adds in that one word. Now, the dissent, the other 4 people on the court, so if you're familiar with the Supreme Court, these names will stack up as the sort of conservative members of the court, the more liberal members of the court, and the guy who got to enjoy being the deciding vote for a long time, Anthony Kennedy. And Scalia says it must be a permanent water, it must be adjacent to a navigable waterway. And Kennedy says, actually, it just needs to have a significant nexus, which that feeling you have about what's a significant nexus is the feeling that everyone had. Because it wasn't very well clarified. There had been one mention of this in one of the earlier cases, that there needed to be some sort of hydrological connection between the navigable waterway and the wetland that was being regulated. And he says, this is fine. This doesn't need to be permanent. These wetlands can dry up for part of the year. That's no big deal. As long as they have some significant connection that helps to preserve the quality of the water, we're going to say that it's okay. And then there was the dissent. So no one knows what their standard is because they didn't actually get to write one. They rejected it. They rejected this portion of it. They said that the majority, or the plurality of the court, was misreading the case entirely, and that they were reducing the effect of the Clean Water Act too much by making it that it only applied to permanent waterways. So what was at stake here is that when you start applying it to permanent waterways, as I'll illustrate here in a second, you lose a lot of coverage of wetlands. So what we ended up with was 4 people over here saying that it should be permanent and adjacent to navigable waterways, 1 person in the middle saying it should have a significant nexus with a navigable waterway, and 1 person saying, or 4 people saying, we disagree. And that was what the Supreme Court left us with in 2006. This goes to the Army Corps of Engineers, where they are required to come up with a standard that meets this somehow. I don't know how they did it. It took about 5 years for them to come up with one. And they, of course, being the Army Corps of Engineers, said, we're going to apply this one. We're going to go with the significant nexus test. Now, a lot of people are like, but that's a strange thing to do because that's only 1 vote. Like, that's the opposite of majority. And that is very true. But that's what they did. But about the time they got done, right, we see a lot more dispute to come. That's what brings us up to the past year. So if we were to go back and take these cases and try to apply it, right, we have navigable waterways here. We have waters that run alongside them, right, or the wetlands that run alongside them. We have these tributaries that you can't really float a boat on, but that have all these wetlands amongst them. And then you have these isolated wetlands, right? And this is actually a graph taken from California. But what we see if we apply those 3 cases would be that we know that the adjacent wetlands are regulatable. We know, right, if they're adjacent to these navigable waterways. And we know that these isolated wetlands are not, because that's what the Swansea case told us. And then the last part is, what do we do with all those? So it looks something like this. What's regulatable for sure is over here. What's definitely not regulatable over there. And the question mark is that big one up there. Most wetlands fall into the, so can the federal government regulate that? Because to protect water quality, it's really important, particularly for groundwater, as we're going to talk about in areas with lots of wetlands. So this is just a side view of the same thing we were just talking about. This would be the navigable waterway. That is for sure within the jurisdiction of the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. And then the area off to the side, the adjacent wetlands, right through here and through here, that is also definitely within the regulatory jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineer. But everything else, once you get outside of that adjacent land, is not regulatable anymore, which means a lot of water is not covered. And so, as with any time you see a confusing court case, what started happening as these cases sort of percolated through the court system, different district courts decided, we like the adjacent test, right? We think it has to be permanent. In some cases, the courts, right, so the circuit court said, no, it has to have a significant nexus. And in some cases, they said, we don't know, pick one, right? So that would be out here in the 8th district. They just said, apply either of these cases, apply the Kennedy test, apply the Scalia test. We're okay with it. Just please apply something. So when the courts start doing that, what happens? It goes back to the Supreme Court. So it went back a couple times in 2009. It went back in 2011. It went back in 2013. I thought most recently it had gone back in 2016. And then back in February, the Supreme Court said that this October, they will be hearing a legal challenge to the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, which means we will be hearing yet again about whether or not there's any clarity about what wetlands are included. But that may not matter, which brings us to the final part. It may not matter because in 2015, the Army Corps of Engineers set out what they claim to be the jurisdiction, right, of the Clean Water Act. And so all the blue that you see there would be waters that are included under the Clean Water Act. To get that list, you have to include traditional navigable waters. You have to include any interstate waters. You have to include any tributary of those previous two. You have to include any adjacent wetlands. You have to include certain isolated waters. But here's the catch. None of them has to be permanent. As long as they're there for part of the year, they can be regulated. So what happened after 2015? Because I said there was something new that happened. So this was under the Obama administration. So February 2017, there was an executive order that came out, and I've selected out the sort of key part of it, which is that the Trump administration said that the Clean Water Act would only rely on, or that the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA would only be able to rely on the Scalia standard, meaning only permanent water would actually be regulatable. So while we've been waiting on the courts to fix it, the executive branch stepped in, and this is what they came up with. Now, at first I thought, well, it's February 2017, maybe they'll forget. But they didn't. They didn't forget, they just waited till it went through the courts again. This is the current status of that rule, the two rules, the big blue map, how it applies throughout the country. All the states in green don't use it. All the states in blue do use it because the courts have said that they were going to issue a stay to the Trump executive order. That stay only applies in the blue states, which we can start to get a sense, if you're paying attention to water law in the United States, that it's really confused. That is, through the courts, it's really confused, and at the state level, it's really confused, and it's been changing a lot. And then in this December, the Army Corps of Engineers said that they would propose a new rule. So in February, they actually published that rule. So they announced it in December, and it made it into the Federal Register in February of this year. And you'll notice what it specifies here. It's following up on the Trump administration's executive order requiring that permanent waters be excluded. So here they say, right, consistent with the executive order. So what this means is they will be issuing a new rule that should, so the comment period just ended, and that new rule will restrict the Clean Water Act only to permanent waterways. So if this takes effect, which it's scheduled to do in September if we follow our rulemaking calendar, then in September when this takes effect, or right around there, it may be that the Supreme Court doesn't need to rule on the issue at all because this would be presumably or potentially the last word. Now, if that were all there was to it, I probably wouldn't have to tell you in so much detail. But here is, as I promised, the sort of basic breakdown of this new rule. It would apply. So this would be regulatable, the navigable waterway. This over here, this little impoundment, and all these tributaries, insofar as you can still float something on them, would be regulatable. But where the water's permanent or perennial, it's still okay, and where it's adjacent, it's still okay. But everything out here, all that land use that starts to move away from that river, that's excluded. And importantly for people who want to drink things, the groundwater is excluded. So all of the sources of pollution that are a problem in a rural area like Wisconsin are not going to be covered. And at first I thought maybe that's not a big deal because this map came out. And I said, phew, thank goodness. I don't live in any of those places, right? So these are watersheds that would be completely excluded under the Clean Water Act. They would no longer be protected by the Clean Water Act because they're not perennial. Now you'll notice they're all in the Southwest, right? It's a desert climate. So that shouldn't shock us terribly that the water that exists there doesn't have sort of a permanent status as a wetland. But from this map, I thought, thank goodness I'm in Wisconsin, right? We've got lots of wetlands, and it doesn't look like we lose much. But I couldn't find an exact calculation of how much we lost, but I could find what nearby areas would lose. So if we look at this map, the blue is what will still be legally protected, and the red is what will no longer be protected waterways. So that is, on the left, that's around the area around Lincoln, Nebraska, and the area on the right is around Des Moines, Iowa. And what we can start to see is what from this slide looks like not a lot of red, when we sort of jump down at a finer level of detail, there's going to be a lot of waterways that are completely unprotected because they're no longer permanent. And that's going to matter in Wisconsin. So I'll wrap up with this point here, which is Wisconsin has also seen changes to its wetlands protections in recent years. So in 2011, Act 21 limited rulemaking authority for agencies, which extended to the DNR. And then in 2011, the same year, we saw Act 118, which titled the Wetlands Reform Bill, which also sort of removed some of the protections for wetlands in Wisconsin. And then finally, in 2017, Act 183 created exemptions for isolated wetlands. So what we start to see is the same thing that we see at the federal level, where unless it's right on a navigable waterway, those wetlands that are further afield from the waterway are no longer protected. Right? And so those are changes that are going to have a pretty tremendous impact on the long-term viability of our water quality in Wisconsin and our abilities to protect it. So I have more I could say, but I think it would be better if I just took questions. Yes, Mark.
By navigable waterway, does that include even the smaller?
If you can float a craft on it, so a canoe. I'll get your question, and then
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of the treatment facility managers, like in one in this area and then on the left. And we asked them how much of this is point source that you can control and influence, and how much is non-point source which you can't influence and control. And it was 85% is non-point source, 15% is point source. So the regulations that are being built by the DNR and others are on that 15%, so they have less contamination, but it is concentrated. That still goes there, and that's a result of some of the blooms of LJ, things like that. And so I'm involved with this technology and trying to solve this problem. And I'm involved with new business development. So I look at it for the same drivers you said on the thing initially was navigable waters, was commerce driven. I think the same thing here, the solutions to this problem has got to be commerce driven also. And I think if we have a solution that has some economic basis, you can extend the laws to say it's going to be more expensive, but you can't put people out of business, or at least sometimes that you have technology to develop to solve the problem. And so we have a project going on right now in the area where we're trying to take the wastewater from the city water supply, put that through a system where we're taking the CO2 from an industrial source and create a usable product. It's called LJ. That LJ is a source of bloom, but it's also a source of a lot of useful products. And it can be food supplements, animal feed. It can also be converted back to, like carbon, to go back into the industrial plant for heating. So you could have a closed loop system, and the same thing with that water. It probably takes the place of a tertiary water system to purify that water. You got primary and secondary now, and then it goes back to probably straight with some dilution. And that's probably okay for most places, but sensitive waters, it's probably not. So I'm looking at a tertiary treatment, and this bacteria, this LJ association will give you the same purity of water coming out that you strain on the front end.
Well, I'm certainly happy to hear about any business effort to try to solve the problem.
The problem is one that you've seen with your chart, where you've seen this federal funding, and these fundings, they don't get the support to do this, so it's really more of a academic, and we're trying to get some of the other people that are socially conscious to help bring this.
And I think that's where
They have both the source of money and the legislation.
I was about to say, I think there seems to be at least going back to the kind of place that we started from, right? I mean, insofar as the Clean Water Act seems not to give us adequate protection, and maybe is even shrinking in its ability to protection, the state still is a source of protection, right? It still has that power. And so one thing we can do as an alternative is to turn to the Wisconsin state government and promote efforts to strengthen water protections there. If the federal government isn't sort of something that we have a great deal of access or control over to try to change.
The two states that are leading in this area of enforcement, not enforcement, but leaders in the water pollution or this water impurity problem, the leaders are Wisconsin and Florida. They're leading the pack. Even though we think it's inadequate, they're still leaders compared to some of the other states, which is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Julie, did you have?
Mine seems like kind of a stupid question, actually, but I don't understand why it's based on commerce, but I guess it's kind of a silly question. But
it's not a silly question. It was a pretty common thing during, the same thing for the Endangered Species Act, right? I mean, when we think of where does Congress have the authority to regulate things, it has to attach back to Article 1, Section 8 somehow. And so it was, Wickard v. Filburn, 1933, 1937, I forget the exact year, but it was this broad expansion of the Commerce Clause powers to sort of deal with some of the problems of the New Deal and the Great Depression, But that broadening of power said the Commerce Clause plus the Necessary and Proper Clause add up to a lot of authority for the federal government. And so for 65 years after that, 60 years after that, you see a lot of laws go through, and it was a simple sort of connection. It was just an easy way to pass a law was to say this hangs on the Commerce Clause. It wasn't until the 1990s that you see a lot of pushback against that. And really, I think it was 1999 was the Morrison case where finally the Supreme Court said, no, not everything can be an extension of commerce. So it was mostly out of convenience, I think.
Would there be a way that you could extend the public doctrine?
The public trust doctrine?
Get where you're navigable, or like even with your groundwater, because your groundwater, you know, like you're saying, the other way, all the way from the headwaters to wherever, you know, they finally meet to the waterway system. So if it could be a more encompassing
I mean,
doing legislation, maybe?
So, I mean, I think that certainly at the state level, the authority exists to have a much broader and deeper protection of our water, whether it be groundwater, whether it be isolated wetlands. The state powers are much clearer, right? Because in Wisconsin, we don't have to turn to something like the Commerce Clause and say, that's where the power comes from. We have much stronger powers in the form of the state's police powers, right, to protect our citizens. We have it in the form of the public trust doctrine to protect the long-run interest of citizens of Wisconsin to healthy waters. And so I think that would be a very reasonable place to turn, would be the authority of the state legislature insofar as it derives from the public trust doctrine. So, are there any other questions or concerns?
It's about complacency. We need another Cuyahoga River episode to wake awareness.
I mean, I don't wish upon anyone another Cuyahoga, but I will say, okay, so as a political scientist, one of the things that sometimes catches me off guard is there's not a strong sort of body of evidence that public opinion has a huge impact on policymaking. But what there is a lot of evidence for is that organized citizens have a huge impact on policymaking. And so if I were to say, like, how do you sort of overcome complacency in a way that's very effective and sort of put your energies into something, it's to organize. That is to work with groups that already have a track record of doing this, that already have the relationships with legislatures, because, right, if it's just a rise in public opinion, there's been a lot of things that sort of disturb the public. I mean, I thought certainly after the Flint water crisis that there would be talk about the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it's sort of come and gone, and shockingly, not a lot has happened. Okay, so we have time for one more question. Or not. No? Okay, well, thank you.